This weekend, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness hit theaters, which means it's time to update my ranking of every film of the MCU from the worst to the best. Coming in at last place at number 28 is Eternals, an incredibly slow, convoluted mess of a film with uninteresting characters and too many plot contrivances. The film looks gorgeous, but the story is all over the place. The story is told out of order, we're not given enough time to connect with these 10 characters to care about them, and some of these characters are shown having died, but then we get the rest of the movie taking place before that scene, and it's basically like if the MCU had skipped all the build-up and decided to just make the Avengers movie first, without giving you any introduction to the members of the team, and on top of that, all these characters are essentially just Superman, so they're way overpowered, which means it's hard for the film to have any actual danger or stakes. Number 27, Incredible Hulk. Another boring, slow, uninteresting MCU film that also feels so disconnected from the MCU. Bruce Banner isn't even Hulk for like 90% of this movie. Most of the film is just spent brooding and moping. The film has awful pacing, and the only interesting part is the last 15 minutes with the big CGI monster fight. And also, way back in 2008 when this came out, they set up Tim Blake Nelson to be a future MCU villain, but to this day, that plotline still hasn't come back. So overall, the film, in the grand scheme of things, just feels inconsequential. Number 26, Thor: The Dark World. One of the most frustrating films on this list because it had the potential to be really good. It had the potential to be really epic and be like Marvel's equivalent of Lord of the Rings. But it falls so short and it falls so flat. The first 30 minutes are this huge exposition dump. The villain is bland and forgettable, and other than a certain character's death and the scenes with Loki and Thor bickering and bantering, the film doesn't have much to offer and is pretty skippable. Number 25, Captain Marvel, a Phase 3 movie that feels like a Phase 1 movie. Now, if this were made during Phase 1, I'd probably be less harsh on it, but given when it came out and how the MCU has evolved up to that point, it feels like a step backwards. Neither the story nor the main character are interesting, and it feels like instead of coming up with an interesting story with a compelling main character, they decided to make a dollar store version of Guardians of the Galaxy. Let's set it in the 90s so we can have 90s songs because people like the 60s songs of Guardians of the Galaxy. People really like Baby Groot. Let's have an animal sidekick in this one. People like the space setting. Let's try and do what we did with Guardians of the Galaxy. The movie also just feels like it exists simply to answer questions nobody was asking in the first place, such as how did Nick Fury lose his eye and where did the name Avengers come from? It is to the MCU what Solo is to Star Wars, except I actually enjoyed Solo and thought that film was fun. Number 24, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. An incredibly dark, graphically violent occult film. While Elizabeth Olsen gives a fantastic performance, and there are some creative and well-directed action sequences, I didn't enjoy the dark direction and themes of this film. I felt very uncomfortable watching it, and this is coming from somebody who enjoys Harry Potter. The film feels gratuitously violent for the sake of shock value. The horror film tone goes way too far. The plot moves way too fast to process most of it, and I just didn't have fun while watching this film. I left feeling very dark instead of with a smile excited for the next one, which is not how I should feel with an MCU movie, or really any comic book movie. And I think part of the problem is Scott Derrickson, who directed the first Doctor Strange, was signed on to direct this film, but left like halfway through over creative differences, and so they replaced him with Sam Raimi, who, other than the Spider-Man films, is known for doing these very dark, R-rated horror films, which is basically what he did with this. How in the world was this allowed to be PG-13? In my opinion, it's definitely an R-rated movie. It's not fun like Raimi's Spider-Man movies. It's dark and violent and just left me feeling icky. Number 23, Iron Man 2. The main problem with this film is way too much goes on. It feels like 3 or 4 different plot ideas that were pitched during the early development of this film, and they tried to combine them all into this absolute Frankenstein's monster of a script. You got a plot about Tony dying and trying to cure himself. You have the Whiplash plot line, the Justin Hammer plot line, setting up the Avengers. It does have some fun action scenes and a well-acted villain with Mickey Rourke's Whiplash, but the film's plot suffers from too many cooks in the kitchen. Number 22, Thor. A film that is well shot and can look gorgeous, but doesn't have that interesting of a plot. It has some good fish-out-of-water comedy, it has a good villain, but the majority of it, other than Loki, is very forgettable. Number 21, Iron Man 3. a movie that I do have fun with, but still has problems. I think people are a little too harsh on the Mandarin twist. I was fine with it even when this film first came out. I like the dynamic between Harvey and Tony, but the biggest problem for me is the ending feels very empty and inconsequential. It attempts to bring closure to the Iron Man character by having him blow up all his suits and retire, but then, 2 movies later, he's changed his mind, thus rendering the emotional punch of the ending pointless. Number 20, Black Panther, a movie that can at times be fun and feel almost like a spy movie with the action and technology, but the plot, when you really analyze it, doesn't really make much sense. The Wakandans choose their leaders based on combat. They're so distrustful of each other that when they send out spies, they send out more spies to spy on their own spies. Their society is run so poorly that their country breaks out into civil war, and yet at the end of the movie they decide they're going to show the rest of the world that their way is best? Huh? Fun action, but a lot of problems with the story. Number 19, Avengers Age of Ultron, a movie that feels like a bit of a step backwards after the first Avengers film. There are some great scenes like the attempts to lift Thor's hammer, which is great foreshadowing of a later film. James Spader gives a great performance as Ultron, but the entire second act slows the film down, and there's this weird romance between Black Widow and Hulk that wasn't ever established beforehand and also never comes back anyway. Number 18, Doctor Strange, a movie with a lot of creative visuals, a main character who starts off super unlikable but goes through a great character journey, lots of unique and creative action sequences, great humor, and is overall a pretty fun movie. Number 17, Thor Ragnarok. After 2 not-so-great Thor movies, we finally get one that's actually fun. I do think there is a bit too much comedy in this film, and it feels like it's trying to imitate Guardians of the Galaxy a bit too much. But Cate Blanchett is great as the villain, there's a lot of fun action, it has a very different flavor to it, and it's overall at least more enjoyable than the previous 2 Thor movies. Number 16, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. While I do still enjoy this film, it seems to have comedy at inappropriate times. You don't always need comedy to lessen the tension. Sometimes you just need to let emotional moments sit, which this film does not do. A lot of times in this film, instead of letting the audience feel the weight of certain moments, they immediately follow it up with a joke. I still think this film was fun, but it's also a bit too crass at points. Number 15, Ant-Man, a movie with a very likable, relatable character. A character who has made mistakes in his life and you want to see him improve and succeed. It's also incredibly funny, has a heist movie feel to it, which is very different than the other MCU films, but what does hold it back is the villain, and at certain points the plot are a bit too similar to the first Iron Man movie. Speaking of which, number 14, Iron Man, a movie that, given its ingredients, should not have worked. Let's make a movie about a character most people outside of the comic book niche box haven't heard of. Let's get the guy who directed Elf to direct this action comic book movie, and also we're going to cast Robert Downey Jr., and at the time washed-up actor nobody wanted to work with. But it somehow had just the right formula to make a fantastic movie. Now, I'm not a fan of Iron Man the character, but as a film, it's well-directed and has a really interesting story. Number 13, Guardians of the Galaxy, a movie that when its trailer came out, everyone thought was going to be awful, but it ended up being such a pleasant surprise for a lot of people. It has a great cast who work very well off of each other with great comedic timing. Each character is a character who has had a bad hand dealt to them in life by their circumstance or their own choices, and you want to see them redeem themselves to succeed, and the film overall is just a blast. Number 12, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Great world building with interesting and creative mythology reminiscent of things like Avatar The Last Airbender, extremely fun and well choreographed martial arts sequences, and a great story. What does hold it back a bit though is Awkwafina. She really brings this film down for me. I find her very loud and annoying, and she just doesn't have a good dynamic with the lead. Still a really fun movie though. Number 11, Ant-Man and the Wasp. Everything that was great about the first Ant-Man movie, this film improves on. It's even funnier, has a more interesting, more fun story, and a much better villain. And it also develops both the main characters in interesting ways, and the film is a lot of fun. Number 10, Spider-Man Far From Home. Creative action sequences, Jake Gyllenhaal is great as the villain, even if he's not the best written as a character, but I do have a few issues with the film. It is a bit too crass with some of the dialogue. There's an incredibly awkward and unneeded scene involving Peter, an adult female S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, and I just can't stand Zendaya. She's just so boring. Number 9, Spider-Man Homecoming, a movie that harkens back to teen films of the 80s, such as Ferris Bueller's Day Off, has a lot of fun moments with Tom Holland perfectly capturing the awkwardness of teenage Peter Parker, but the film doesn't really give Peter a chance to stand on his own. It relies a bit too much on the legacy of Iron Man, which is a bit distracting. Number 8, Black Widow. Take notes, Brad Bird. This is how you should have directed Incredibles 2. This feels like a fusion of the first Incredibles movie with the superhero family aspect and a Mission Impossible movie with the spy and political thriller aspect. It has incredibly fun, well-paced action. The entire cast has a great dynamic. There's a lot of emotional moments that feel earned, and the villain is absolutely despicable and is this guy that you just love to hate. Number 7, Captain America the First Avenger. Even 11 years later, even with almost 30 movies in the MCU, this film still stands out, even if it's an early entry. Unlike the other characters we've been introduced to up to this point, the main character is just an ordinary guy who wants to reach his full potential and do the right thing. He's not a billionaire genius, he's not a scientist, he's not a god, he's just an ordinary guy. The film also breaks the traditional comic book movie formula by setting it in World War II, which also adds to its uniqueness. Number 6, The Avengers. After 4 years and 5 films of build-up, this is the payoff, and it's great. The whole cast and script are very sharp and quick. The film has great comic book movie action, and it's just a darn good time. Number 5, Captain America Civil War. A movie with a lot of compelling ideas that lets the audience choose who they side with. It has one of the greatest action sequences in the MCU with the battle at the airport, and it introduces us to the MCU's version of Spider-Man, but there are a couple of issues. I think Spider-Man's intro scene could have been better. Aunt May just lets Tony Stark, this grown man she's never met, into her teenage nephew's bedroom alone, where he then also locks the door and tells him to lie to her about where he was and what he was doing. That's very irresponsible. Also, given how Endgame ends, this now means that Captain America is kissing his niece, which is also very awkward. Now, when this film came out, it was awkward because it was somebody he didn't know that well, but now it's awkward for a whole different reason. Number 4, Captain America the Winter Soldier. An intriguing political thriller with a fresh flavor of the MCU. The stakes are different, the action is more street level, the plot is incredibly intriguing, and it feels very different than any other comic book movie out there. Cap and Black Widow have great chemistry, and this is actually a movie that made me ship them, and I really wish they had followed through with it. Number 3, Avengers Endgame. An almost perfect finale to the Infinity Saga. Overall, it's a fantastic movie and is incredibly satisfying, but my issue is by making Cap go back to live with Peggy, as I've said before, it now means he's related to Sharon Carter, which means he was kissing his niece in the Civil War movie. This is why you go back and read what you wrote. Number 2, Avengers Infinity War. The payoff to a massive story with tons of characters, and it really works. The opening scene pulls no punches, very quickly establishes the threat and stakes, and it just keeps getting better from there. Every character interacts well with each other, the action is exciting, the plot has high stakes, Thanos is probably one of the greatest villains in all of cinema, it's very well acted and well written, and it has one of the most shocking cliffhangers in the MCU. And coming in at first place is Spider-Man No Way Home. Every Spider-Man character from the various franchises, whether they be hero or villain, are given closure to their character arcs in a satisfying way. The MCU Peter Parker matures a lot more by the end of the film. It has a lot of emotion, classic comic book action, and is a great send-off to 20 years and 8 films of Spider-Man. So there you have it. That's my number 1 pick for the best film of the MCU. Go ahead and share your ranking of the MCU films, including Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, and I will see you next time.